Douglas Murray, outside the Ministry of Defence, joins us now in our little Ministry of Sound and Fury. Welcome to This Week.
Good to be with you.
Michael, let me start with you as a former Defence Secretary. What do you make of General Dannett's move this week into the Tory fold?
I think from his point of view it's probably quite unwise, partly because he's only just come out of the army, and partly because he's been appointed by a kind of press release in the middle of a Conservative Party conference. And therefore, I myself wouldn't feel very confident of what that position really amounts to, because it clearly has symbolic and political effect now. It's an unfortunate way to go. So I think probably, from his point of view, it's been a misjudgment to accept the appointment.
Isn't the idea that he'll go to the Lords and become a defence minister?
Yes, but what's...
Well, Mr Cameron said today could be a minister. It was conditional on that. The thing that puzzles me, Diane, though, is that as an army, as the man who had just stepped down from running the British Army and thought to be independent, he was causing the government massive collateral damage.
I think that...
Now he's a Tory general.
That has not escaped my colleagues' attention. It doesn't do anything for relationships between politicians and generals going forward. And I will just say this, it wasn't helped by Chris Grayling when the idea was put to him, so, oh, this is just a cheap political gimmick, only to find out it was David Cameron's cheap political gimmick.
Not first politicians have one rule for them and another rule for the others. What do you make of it? Because it has puzzled me. I would have thought it would... It wouldn't stop the Tories giving him a job if they get into power sometime next year. But at the moment, as a man who was recently head of the army, having to deal with Gordon Brown, often being turned down, he had huge credibility. Now that can be knocked.
Absolutely. I mean, his criticisms of Gordon Brown, the lack of provisions for our troops, the lack of troops in Afghanistan, these were very powerful criticisms to be making. And now it's just too easy for the Labour Party to be claiming that he's a stooge of the Conservatives. And the other thing, of course, is that if Dannett does take up a post in any future Conservative government, this is a serious problem for his successor. The Chief of General Staff under the Conservative government would, I think, be very uneasy about having his predecessor breathing down his neck. This is not a great move from anyone's point of view.
And even worse than that, actually, there's also now a question about what are the opinions of the Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Jot Stirrup. It's been said that Sir Jot Stirrup, you know, is just as unhappy as Dannett has been about the troop numbers. So now, you know, kind of by implication, even the criticisms that are made by the Chief of the Defence Staff, who's a completely non-political figure, will to some extent be discredited because they say, you know, you, like Dannett, are probably just a Tory supporter.
Is our military becoming politicised?
Well, I think there is a risk that we're going that way. This is what's been happening in America, as I mentioned in the film briefly. That, you know, McChrystal's just suffered this with his recent...
the American general.
With his recent calls for troop increases. It's interpreted as being a political move and this sort of thing. We really do need our military commanders to be clearly in the public eye and in the eyes of our politicians advising the best advice they can give on behalf of the troops. The idea they could ever become party political stooges is seriously problematic.
I would suggest, Diane, that maybe one of the reasons the top brass has become more politicised is because during the 12 years of this government, it's consistently sent our military forces to war on peacetime budgets.
I think there's something in that. I mean, Blair, you know, was this great liberal interventionist, but he didn't want to...
Spend the money.
He didn't want to spend the money.
Well, Gordon Brown didn't
really
want to spend the money.
Yeah, no, you know, I mean, Blair wrote cheques which Gordon wasn't prepared to honour in political terms, yeah.
Yeah, but I think there's a huge difference between Blair and the generals and Brown and the generals. I mean, even though Blair wasn't spending the money, maybe it was his chancellor who was refusing to spend it, Blair was pretty popular with the armed forces, yes, and had a way with them. And Brown just the opposite. I mean, I think, you know, what's happened with General Dannett, as I say, I think he's been unwise to do this, but I think it's probably been as a result of immense provocation. He obviously feels deeply frustrated. And I think it is extraordinary that Gordon Brown has presided over such a breakdown between the political class and the generals.
Well, it's unprecedented in modern times.
And they're really not given to this. By the way, just while we're...
No, but do you know that there's been this personal breakdown, or have you just read about it? Because I wasn't.
Well, you read about it all the time, don't you?
It's not hard to hear about the personal provocation of Dannett as well.
If you speak privately to these generals, they tell you.
Dannett,
a junior member of the government,
smear campaign against Dannett was really quite extraordinary. And I mean, the government, to some extent, is reaping what it sowed. I just think it's a shame that in this particular case, Dannett should have risen to that bait. I can understand why but I think it's going to be regrettable in the long
They
term.
tried to get him on his expenses, and it turns out he bought his wine in Lidl or something.
He didn't have an MP's taste
bottle.
for expenses, let's put it like that.
Let's move on to Afghanistan itself. Then stick to the British military for the moment. Is the problem in Afghanistan for the top brass? Is it lack of men and materiel, or is it concern that there seems to be no clear strategy?
Well, it's a complete lack of political leadership and a lack of a clear strategy. The military will keep on asking for more troops, and they actually need more troops at the moment. If we're going to see replicated in Afghanistan, something like we saw in Iraq, particularly the so-called Sunni awakening, if that were to be replicated in Afghanistan, this is going to need more troops. Those troops are going to have to come from this country, America, elsewhere. But it's also important not to forget that this is a NATO operation, and our colleagues in NATO have to rise to the occasion on this. And
there's no sign of that.
There's no sign of it at all.
Sarkozy's not going to do that.
No
Berlusconi is now walking wounded. Mrs. Merkel shows no desire to do so. These are the only other three with any real...
This is why they have to consider what the implications are long-term for NATO if this fails.
I heard our Defence Secretary the other day unable to give any opinion as to what the British view of what the strategy should be. In other words, we're waiting for the United States to make up its mind what the strategy should be. There is a range of possible strategies, from at the top end, you know, trying to create capitalism and a democratic society and rights for women in Afghanistan, right down to, at the other end, simply making sure that Al-Qaeda is no longer there. And I don't think yet President Obama has decided where he wants to be on this spectrum and how many troops he wants to send. And the British government is simply waiting for the Americans to
Literally,
decide.
they're split. Biden would withdraw almost wholly, but there are also other pressures to say, let's double down in Afghanistan. But
Is there still the political will to fight this war in the government?
Well, it depends what you want out of this war. I mean, we haven't found, you know, we haven't brought the Al-Qaeda to book. And I would say this, I was in Afghanistan earlier this year, and if you talk to ordinary soldiers who've been out there on maybe 3 tours of duty, they will say, when they first came out, they were liberators, now they are resented. And you see what's happening, it's not just an ideological thing. The Afghanistans want the foreign troops out.
Let me ask you this. There are rumours coming out of Washington tonight that President Obama is finally going to make up his mind, that he is largely going to back the McChrystal report. There could be an extra 40,000 troops being sent there from America. That must have implications for us. Pressure must come on Mr. Brown now.
Yes, I mean, if Mr. Brown is going to keep any semblance of the special relationship alive, he's going to have to step up, and we're going to have to provide more troops. The problem is, as I mentioned in the film, the problem is not that whether or not we can provide the military, but whether or not we have the political leadership from this Prime Minister or from any Prime Minister to show the people of this country why we're there, why we need to continue to be there.
The fear in America, though, is this could turn into Obama's Vietnam. And the fear must be amongst British politicians that the British public will not tolerate pouring all this money into a long-term war like Vietnam.
But that is only to state one half of the argument.
What's the other half?
Well, in Pakistan at the moment, the Pakistanis are seriously fighting Al-Qaeda. It's the first time
Are
they've
they?
done so.
The army and the security services?
Absolutely. The SWAT Valley earlier this year. The SWAT Valley earlier this year. They were not far from
services were great supporters.
And so you would argue, obviously, then, if that's happening on that side of the border, we have to keep up the pressure on the other. But let me ask you this, coming back to the domestic situation here, Michael. President Obama, who had been against the Iraq war, has made Afghanistan his war. He made that on the campaign trail, and he continues to do so, and he'll do so even more if he follows the McChrystal report. Does this become David Cameron's war? Is David Cameron as Mr. Obama?
Well, I think you can start by saying that he's more enthusiastic for it than Gordon Brown appears to be.
Really?
And I'm judging by the speech that David Cameron made today. I mean, almost the first thing he said was about Afghanistan.
Oh, it was the first thing he said.
To restate very clearly, you know, why we were there, why it mattered, and to imply that we would continue to be there, and we'd be there in the numbers that were necessary.
Isn't that
He
just
gave no indication that he would support extra numbers or extra resources.
Isn't that just a nod to the sun and their campaign around our troops?
Well, it's a nod to be saying something nice without committing yourself to anything.
Yeah.
Well,
always been the
that's how Obama began, with campaign promises.
There's also always been the presumption that the Iraq was a bad war, Afghanistan's a good war, you've got to show your support for Afghanistan. But we do need to remember, this isn't just about supporting our troops, this is an important thing for any potential Prime Minister to be doing. We've also got to see from our leaders, not just the political determination, but an explanation to the people of what failure on the Afghan side of the border would mean, not just for Afghanistan, but for Pakistan as well. And that's a very worrying scenario.
Douglas Murray, we have to leave it there, but we thank you for coming on.
Thank you.